I will present some results I obtained during my thesis. And the subject of my thesis was digraph coloring, and it was supervised by Frédéric Havet and co-advised by Stéphane Bessy. And first, let me recall to everyone what is a coloring of a graph. So proper coloring of a graph is a coloring of its vertices, such that when you have two adjacent vertices, so two vertices linked with an edge, then they receive distinct colors. And what we call the chromatic number of a graph is the minimum number of colors we need to find a proper coloring of this graph. And we say that it is a proper K coloring if we only use at most K colors. So in this example, the chromatic number is 3. So you see it is at most 3 because indeed we have a proper 3 coloring of this graph. And it is at least 3 because you have a node cycle here. And on a node cycle, you need at least 3 colors. Now for digraphs, we will talk about dicolorings, and the dicoloring is coloring of the vertices such that each color class induces an acyclic subdigraph. Or in other words, every directed cycle uses at least 2 distinct colors. So this is an example of a 3 dicoloring of a digraph. So you see here that we have a directed cycle, so we must use 2 colors on it. And you see here that we have a cycle, but it is not directed, so we are allowed to use only 1 color. And finally, note that when we have what I call a digon, so 2 arcs in the opposite directions between the same pair of vertices, then we need 2 distinct colors for these vertices. And what we call the dichromatic number of a digraph is again the minimum number of colors we need to find a dicoloring of this digraph. So in this example, the dichromatic number is 3. And this is at most 3 because we indeed have a 3 dicoloring. And it is exactly 3 because you see that we have a bidirected triangle here. And on these vertices, we need 3 distinct colors. And these 2 notions generalize the ones of proper coloring and chromatic number for undirected graphs, just because if you take any graph and then you look at the digraph you obtained by replacing every edge by a digon, then the proper colorings of the initial graph are exactly the dicolorings of the obtained digraph. And in particular, the chromatic number is equal to the dichromatic number. And then if you think about any result on graph coloring, in fact, you can see it as a result on dicolorings of bidirected graphs, which are the digraphs in which every arc is in a digon. And then 2 questions naturally arise. The first one is this result on bidirected graphs true not only for bidirected graphs, but for all digraphs? So can we generalize it to all digraphs or not? And if we can we strengthen it on a disjoint class of digraphs? And usually we look at oriented graphs, which are the digon-free digraphs, so digraphs without any digon. And these were the 2 main questions I considered during my thesis. And I would like to start by illustrating these 2 questions with 2 emblematic results on graph coloring. And the first one is the strong perfect graph theorem due to Chudnovsky et al. And for this, I need a few definitions. So what we call the clique number of a graph is the size of a largest clique in the graph, where clique is a set of pairwise adjacent vertices. And what is clear is that the clique number, the chromatic number is always at least the clique number, just because when you take a proper coloring, you need to use distinct colors on every vertex of the clique. And we say that a graph is perfect if in fact equality holds, not only for this graph, but for each of its induced subgraphs. And then if we look for necessary conditions for a graph to be perfect, then we see that it cannot contain a dot hole, which is an induced cycle of odd length, and of odd length at least 5. Because in this case, the clique number is 2, but the chromatic number is 3. And also, it cannot contain a node antihole, which is just the complementary of a node hole. Because in this case, the clique number is a number of vertices minus 1 over 2, and the chromatic number is 1 more. So we have a necessary condition for a graph to be perfect. It cannot contain one of these 2 obstructions. In fact, the strong perfect graph theorem says that this easy condition is indeed sufficient. So this is an exact characterization of perfect graphs. And then we can ask what is happening for digraphs. So now what we call the biclique number is the size of a largest biclique, where a biclique is a set of vertices that are pairwise linked with a digon. And again, we have that the dichromatic number is at least the biclique number. And we say that the digraph is perfect if equality holds, between the dichromatic number and the B-click number, not only for this digraph, but for each of its induced subdigraphs. And again, we can find necessary conditions for a digraph to be perfect. The first one is it cannot contain a bidirected node hole, which is obtained from a node hole by replacing every edge by a diagon. And then we are allowed to put some arcs, but these chords cannot be diagons. It must be simple arcs. And then we cannot have a bidirected node antihole, which is obtained in the same way from a node antihole. And again, we can put simple arcs here, but no diagon. And there is a new obstruction, which are induced directed cycle of length at least 3, because in this case, the B-click number is 1. We don't have any diagon, but we indeed need 2 colors for it because it is not acyclic. So we again have this necessary condition for a digraph to be perfect. And it turns out that this is also a sufficient condition. So it's an exact characterization of perfect digraphs. And this is a result of Andres and Hochstetler. And this illustrates the first question we had. We have a result on graph coloring, and we generalize it to digraphs. And the second question would be, what can we say about oriented graphs? And in this case, it is not so interesting. We just have that an oriented graph is perfect if only if it is acyclic. And now I would like to consider another emblematic result on graph coloring for which we will have the opposite. So the first question will be easy, but the second will turn out to be challenging. So the 4-color theorem says that every planar graph has chromatic number at most 4. And from this, we directly obtain that every planar digraph has dichromatic number at most 4. This is just because if you have a planar digraph, you can forget its orientations. You just see it as a graph, and you can color it into independent sets with 4 colors. And these independent sets, a fortiori, are acyclic subdigraph. And of course, this is best possible just because a complete bidirected graph on 4 vertices needs 4 colors. But then we can ask what is happening for oriented graphs. And this is one of the most celebrated conjecture on the dichromatic number, which says that, in fact, the dichromatic number of every oriented planar graph should be at most 2. This is the conjecture of Neumann-Lara. And we know it is at most 3 just because of the low density of planar graphs, but for 2 it is open. So these 2 examples illustrate the interest of these 2 questions I considered during my thesis, and I considered them with many classical results on graph coloring. And today I will first talk briefly about some results I obtained on diacritical digraphs, and also about digraph with coloring. And then I will talk in details about the Brooks theorem and its generalizations. So let's start with diacritical digraphs. So we say that a digraph is k diacritical if its dichromatic number is k, but if you remove any arc or any vertex, its dichromatic number decreases to k minus 1. So these digraphs are somehow the minimal obstruction to the k minus 1 dicolorability. And then we define in the same way that a graph is k critical if it has chromatic number k, but if you remove a vertex or an edge, it decreases to k minus 1. And for these particular graphs and digraphs, a natural question is to ask what is the minimum density of such graphs and digraphs. And for this, we introduced gk of n, which is just the minimum number of edges in a k critical graph on n vertices. And the same way, we define dk of n, which is the minimum number of arcs in a k diacritical digraph on n vertices, and ok of n, which is just the same for oriented graphs. And we directly obtain some easy bounds by definition. The first one is that gk of n is always at most twice gk of n. And this is because if you have a k critical graph and you replace every edge by a diagon, you obtain a k diacritical digraph for which the number of arcs is twice the number of edges of the original graph. And the second one is that ok of n is at least gk of n. And this is just because every oriented graph is a digraph. And Kostoshka and Stibitz introduced the study of the functions dk and ok, and they made mainly two conjectures on this topic related to these 2 easy inequalities. The first one is that, in fact, there should be equality between dk of n and twice gk of n. And moreover, they conjecture that the sparsest k diacritical digraphs must be bidirected. So these must be exactly the diacritical digraphs obtained from sparse critical graph by replacing the edges by diagons. And they made a second conjecture, which is that there should be a significant gap between OK and GK. So OK of n should be at least 1 plus some epsilon times dk of n. And both conjectures are still open. And what is known on this topic is the following. So in the undirected case, almost everything is done. So there is a famous bound due to Kostoschka and Yancey that they obtained with the potential method, which is almost best possible in the sense that this is the exact value of gk of n for every fixed k and infinitely many values of n. So almost everything is done. And then we can look at the weaker form of the first conjecture of Kostoschka and Shibitz, because if gk of n is twice gk of n, then in particular it should be at least this, and already this is open. And this is not only for low values of k. And the best bound we know in general is due to Abulker and Vermond, and it is close to the conjectured one, but you see that we still have a gap of roughly n over 2. And for the second conjecture, all the cases except the case k equals 3 are open. And my contributions to this topic are the following. In the first work with Michael Stibitz, we gave the exact value of dk of n when n is not too large compared to k. So n is between k and 2k minus 1. In this case, we are able to give the exact value of dk of n. And so this generalizes the result of Galai, and we are also able to characterize exactly the k diacritical digraphs on n vertices with exactly dk of n arcs. And this confirms completely the first conjecture of Kostoschka and Stibitz in this particular case. And in a second work with Frédéric Havet and Clément Rambaud, we gave a general result on 4 diacritical digraphs using the potential method, which mainly has 2 consequences. The first one is a lower bound on d4 of n, which was already known, but we also characterize exactly the diacritical digraphs with exactly this number of arcs. So this confirms the first conjecture for the case k equals 4. And the second main consequence of our general result is an answer to the second conjecture for k equals 4, which is that there is a significant gap between O4 and D4, so a gap of roughly n over 51. Now I would like to briefly talk about a second important part of my thesis, which is the notion of digraph redicolouring. And for this, I need the introduction of an auxiliary graph. So given a digraph D, what we call the k dicolouring graph of D is the undirected graph in which the vertices are all the k dicolourings of D. And there is an edge between 2 colourings if they differ on exactly 1 vertex. Okay. So for instance, this is a 2 dicolouring graph of the directed triangle. And then we can define the k coloring graph of an undirected graph in the same way, but taking proper colorings instead of dicolorings. And what we call a recoloring sequence of a digraph is a path in this k dicoloring graph. So it can be seen as a sequence of dicolorings, such that when you take 2 consecutive colorings, they differ on exactly 1 vertex. And we say that a digraph is k-mixing if its k dicoloring graph is connected. So for any pair of k dicolorings, you indeed have a recoloring sequence between them. And the main questions we consider on this topic are, first, given a digraph D, can we have a guarantee that it is k-mixing for some integer k? And secondly, if it is k-mixing, can we also find bounds on the diameter of the k dicoloring graph? So we know that not only for any pair of dicolorings you have a recoloring sequence between them, but also that it must be short, it cannot be long. And so what is known on this topic? Well, for undirected graphs, these questions have been considered by Bonsma and Cereceda and Dyer et al., who independently proved that if you take a number of colors which is at least the degeneracy of your graph plus 2, then your graph must be k-mixing for this number of colors k, where the degeneracy is the least integer d, such that you can eliminate the vertices of your graph one after the other by eliminating vertices of degree at most b. And Cereceda made a celebrated conjecture that not only with this number of colors G must be k-mixing, but also the diameter should be bounded by a quadratic function in the number of vertices of G, and this is still open. And the best results towards this conjecture are due to Buske and Heinrich, who proved that first we have a polynomial bound in the number of vertices when the degeneracy is fixed. And secondly, if we increase the number of colors to 3/2 times the degeneracy plus 1, then we indeed obtain a quadratic diameter. And Bousquet and Perarnaud proved that if we even increase the number of colors to twice degeneracy plus 1, then we obtain a linear diameter in the number of vertices. And in a first work with Nicolas Bousquet, Frédéric Havet, Nicolas Nice, and Amadeus Reynolds, we considered the same question for digraphs, where the degeneracy is the same notion, but you take the degree of a vertex to be the minimum between its in and out degrees. And we proved that with this number of colors, your digraph must be k-mixing. And we made the same conjecture that we indeed should have a quadratic diameter of the k dicolouring graph in the number of vertices. And then we proved that if we increase the number of colors to 3/2 times the degeneracy plus 1, we indeed obtain a quadratic diameter. If we increase it to twice degeneracy plus 1, we obtain a linear diameter. So you see that we generalized everything but the general bond, the general polynomial bond in N. And this we managed to obtain it later with Nicolas Nice and Ignacy Sau in a second work. Now I would like to talk in details about Brooks' theorem and its generalizations. So Brooks' theorem says that if you have a connected graph, then its chromatic number is always at most its maximum degree, unless it is one of the following obstructions. So either an odd cycle, in which case the maximum degree is 2, but you indeed need 3 colors, or a complete graph, in which case the maximum degree is the number of vertices minus 1, but you indeed need 1 color per vertex. And then again, you can ask what is happening for digraphs. And for this, you first need a definition of the maximum degree in a digraph. So we will first consider the maximum of a degree of a digraph to be delta max of D, which is the maximum on every vertex of the maximum between its in and out degrees. And with this definition, Mohar obtained a generalization of Brooks' theorem, which says if you take a connected digraph, then its dichromatic number must be at most delta max, unless D is one of the following obstructions. So of course we find the two same obstructions, so a bidirected odd cycle, a bidirected complete graph, and there is a new one, which is a directed cycle. In this case, delta max is 1, but we indeed need 2 colors. And this generalizes the result of Brooks when we look at it on bidirected graphs. And this is an example of a generalization of Brooks' theorem, but this is not the only one. And in particular, there is a result about list coloring due to Borodin and Erdős et al. So in the concept of list coloring, every vertex receives a list of available colors, and what you want is to find a proper coloring of your graph such that the color of every vertex belongs to its list of available colors. And now, if you have a list assignment such that the number of available colors on V is always at least the degree of V on every vertex V, then your graph must be L colorable for this list assignment L, unless it is a Galley tree, where Galley tree is any graph for which each block is an obstruction of Brooks' theorem, so a complete graph or an odd cycle. And from this, you can obtain Brooks' theorem by saying the list on every vertex is just all the integers from 1 to the maximum degree delta. And then, okay, this is not hard, but you can check that you can obtain Brooks' theorem from it. And again, we can ask what is happening for digraphs. And this is a result of Harutunian and Mohar, that now if you have a list of available colors on every vertex of a digraph, such that the number of available colors is at least the maximum between the in and out degrees, then our digraph must be L dicolorable, unless it is a directed Galley tree, where a directed Galley tree is any digraph for which every block is an obstruction of the directed Brooks theorem, so either a bidirected complete graph, a bidirected cycle, or just a directed cycle. And these are examples of generalization of Brooks' theorem, and we can represent them on this diagram. So there is an arc from theorem A to theorem B whenever theorem A generalizes theorem B. But these are not the only one. In particular, there is a result about partitioning a graph into degenerate subgraphs due to Borodin. And then we can ask for a common generalization of these two independent results. And this has been done by Borodin et al. When they introduced the notion of variable degeneracy. And then what we want is to find a common generalization of these two independent results. And this has been done by Bang-Jensen et al. When they introduced the notion of variable degeneracy for digraphs. And in a work with Daniel Gonçalves and Amadeus Reynolds, we proposed another definition of the variable degeneracy of a digraph that we call bivariable degeneracy. And we proved the analog of Brooks' theorem with this notion, which generalizes the one of Monk-Jensen et al. So it generalizes all these results. And it's interesting not only from a structural point of view, but also from an algorithmic point of view, because all these results are of the form, if I have a graph and I have this number of colors, I can always color my graph in such a way that each color class satisfies some property, unless my graph is one of the following obstructions. But then a natural question is, how hard is it to actually compute this coloring? And usually all these proofs give a polynomial time algorithm. So the natural question is whether we can obtain linear time algorithms. And this was open for the variable degeneracy cases. And we indeed give a general framework to obtain linear time algorithms for all these problems here. Now I would like to give you the statements, but I first need a few definitions. So if I have a digraph D and a function f which associates to every vertex of D two integers, then we say that D is f degenerate if for every non-empty subdigraph h of D I can find a vertex V such that its in degree is less than the function f minus on V, and the out degree is less than f plus of V, where f plus and f minus, or f minus and f plus are respectively the projections on the first and second coordinates of the function f. So how can we use it? For instance, we can say that the digraph is acyclic if only if it is f degenerate, where f is a function constant equal to 1, 1. This is just because when you have a digraph, it is acyclic if only if for every non-empty subdigraph we can find a vertex with in degree 0 or out degree 0. Now, if we have a sequence of functions f1 to fs, we say that D is f dicolorable if we can color the vertices with colors from 1 to s, such that the vertices colored I induce an fi degenerate subdigraph. So let me give some example. So for instance, we can modelize dicoloring. We just say that a dichromatic number of a digraph is at most s, if only if it is f dicolorable, where f is a sequence of s functions, and each of these functions is constant equal to 1, 1. But we can also modelize list dicoloring by saying that fi of v is equal to 1, 1 if color v is available for v, if color I is available for v, and 0, 0 otherwise. And note that if fi of v is 0, 0, then we cannot color v with color I. Otherwise, when we look at the induced subdigraph, which is just induced by v, then you cannot eliminate the only vertex v, because this is 0 and 0, and this is not less than 0. Now I need to define what is a hard pair, and these will be the obstructions in our statement, in the same way that we have some obstructions in Brooks' theorem. And we will construct them inductively. So first we say that df is a hard pair if one of the following holds. So D might be any digraph, but we have only one function that is not constant equal to 0. And this unique function is equal to the in degree and the out degree of the vertex for each. So this is an example of a hard pair. So you see that we only have one available color. So we are forced to color all the vertices in red. But then if they are all colored red, this is not a Neff dicoloring because you cannot eliminate any vertex. Because you have, you have that the in degree is exactly f minus and the out degree is exactly f plus. And then we find the same obstructions as in Brooks' theorem. So D might be a bidirected cycle. And we have exactly two functions that are not constant equal to 0, 0. And they are constant equal to 1, 1. And in this case, we are just trying to two-color a knot cycle, so this is not possible. And finally, D might be a bidirected complete graph. And then we have that all the functions must be constant, symmetric, so the first coordinate is equal to the second coordinate. And they must sum to the number of vertices minus 1. So this is an example. You see that you cannot color two vertices in red, otherwise these vertices do not induce a 1, 1 degenerate subdigraph. And for the same reasons, you cannot have three vertices in green, so you cannot color it. And these are the three basic blocks of our obstructions, and then we can construct larger hard pairs by saying that if we have two hard pairs and we just glue them on a vertex, and on this vertex we just sum the functions pairwise coordinate, then what we obtain is again a hard pair, and we can continue like this to obtain larger and larger hard pairs. And again, we can easily check that the pairs we are constructing are not colorable. And our result is the following. So if we have a connected digraph and a sequence of functions, then we need a notion of color budget on every vertex. So for list coloring, it was the number of available colors is always at least a degree. Now we have that sum of the functions on the first coordinate is always at least the in degree of the vertex, and the sum of the functions on the second coordinate is always at least the out degree. And then if we have this condition, D must be F dicolorable unless it is a hard pair. So these are exactly the obstructions. In fact, it is an if only if. Then if we look at the consequences, well, if we restrict this result to symmetric functions, so the first coordinate being equal to the second coordinate, we obtain exactly the result of Bang-Jensen et al. And if we further assume that our functions are valued in 0, 0, or 1, 1, we are just modelizing least dicoloring, and we obtain the result of Hautunian and Mohara. And if we further assume that all the functions are constantly equal to 1, 1, then we are just modelizing least dicoloring, and we can obtain the directed Brooks theorem. Now I would like to show you the proof. And the main tool for the proof is the following observation. Imagine that we have a vertex V, and we decided to color V with color I. And this is possible only if Fi of V is not 0, 0. Otherwise, we cannot color V with color I. And then we just want to remove V and remember that it is colored I. And for this, we just have to update the color budget on every neighbor of V, so they remember that they have a neighbor colored I. And in fact, we'll just update the color budget for color I. So every in neighbor of V will decrease its functions by 0, 1. So it remembers that it has an out neighbor colored I. And every out neighbor will decrease its function Fi by 1, 0. And every neighbor which is both an out and in neighbor will decrease it by 1, 1. And then you can easily show that if you have an F prime dicoloring of D minus V, you can extend it into an F dicoloring of D by coloring V with color I. And this is the main tool. And now let's see a sketch of the proof. So we have DF, which is a non-hard pair. Then the very first step consists of reducing to the case where we only have two colors. And for this, we just say that the first colors will be Fi for some well-chosen I. And F2 prime will be the sum of the other functions. And then you can show that if you choose I carefully, what you obtain here is again a non-hard pair. And that using a greedy procedure, you can transform an F prime dicoloring of D into an F dicoloring of D. Then what we want is to reduce to another hard pair for which the digraph is two connected. So assume that we have a cut vertex in the underlying graph of D. Then we just want to color one part of the digraph and reduce to the other part. And for this, okay, we just take a spanning tree. So let's say we want to color the left side. Then we take a spanning tree of the left side rooted in X, and we color the vertices from the leaves to the root. And using the fact that when we color a vertex, it has an uncolored neighbor, we can always justify that one of color 2 or 1 must be available for this vertex, such that the vertices colored 1 induce an F1 degenerate subdigraph, and vertices colored 2 induce an F2 degenerate subdigraph. Then we have to remember that X has some neighbor already colored, so we update the first function by decreasing the first coordinate by the number of in neighbors colored 1, and the second coordinate by the number of out neighbors colored 1. And then we update the second function by decreasing by the number of in neighbors colored 2, and the second coordinate by the number of out neighbors colored 2. And then we can continue this process unless what we obtain here is a hard pair. And if this is the case, we just do the opposite, so we color the right side. And if this is again a hard pair, then we have a contradiction because we have two hard pairs glued on X, and this is again a hard pair. So if we continue this process, we will manage to obtain a smaller pair for which the digraph is two connected. And then the third and fourth steps consist of proving that we can assume that both colors must be available on every vertex, and that the underlying graph of our digraph is not just a cycle. The idea is that if one of these two properties is not true, then we can directly find an F dicoloring of our digraph. And then now we can separate two cases. The first case is we have a vertex V such that when we remove it, our digraph remains two connected. And in this case, we just want to color V with, let's say, color 1, and to update the colors on its neighbors in such a way that what we are reducing to is a non-hard pair. But we know that it remains two connected, so it is easy to detect if it is a hard pair or not. And if it is a hard pair, then we use the fact that both colors are available for V, and we just color V with the other color. And this is a bit of case analysis, but you can show that one of these two colors must always be available for V, such that we are not reducing to a hard pair. And if we don't have such a vertex that we can remove, then using an analog of ear decomposition, we can show that in our digraph, in the underlying graph, there is a path P in which every vertex has degree exactly 2 in the underlying graph. And when you remove it, when you remove the path, what you obtain is again 2 connected. And then we just do the same. So we try to color it. So we use the fact that both colors are available on every vertex, and we color the path with color 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And we look at the reduced pair. If it is a hard pair, then we color with the opposite. And again, we justify that one of these two choices must not reduce to a hard pair. So this is the proof. Now I would like to come back to the directed Brooke theorem and discuss some strengthening of this result. So we call that it says that the dichromatic number of a digraph is always at most delta max unless it is an obstruction, where delta max is the maximum on every vertex of the maximum between its in and out degrees. But this is not the only definition of the maximum degree of a digraph. And for instance, we can look at delta min, which is the maximum on every vertex of the minimum between its in and out degrees. And using an easy greedy procedure, we indeed have that the dichromatic number is always at most delta min plus 1. Then a natural question is whether we can characterize the digraphs for which the dichromatic number is exactly delta min plus 1, which would be a strengthening of the result of Mohar, because every digraph for which equality holds with delta max is digraph for which equality holds with delta min. So it would be a better characterization. But there is little hope for such a characterization because, and this is a result of Aboulker and Aubion, deciding if the dichromatic number is at most delta min is already an NP complete problem. So we cannot expect an easy characterization of such a characterization. But still, we can look for necessary conditions for a digraph to have dichromatic number delta min plus 1. And this is a contribution of mine, that if a digraph D has dichromatic number exactly delta min plus 1, then one of the following holds. First, delta min is at most 1, and we cannot say anything. For instance, D might be a cycle with some chords. Or delta min is 2, and in this case, D must contain a diagon. Or delta min is at least 3, and in this case, D must contain a bidirected complete graph on S vertices, a bidirected complete graph on T vertices, and every arc from Ks to Kt, where S and T sums to delta min plus 1. So we do not have a bidirected complete graph on delta plus 1 vertices, but almost. We are allowed to have a cut for which the arcs are only going in one direction. And if we look at this, the consequences of this result on oriented graphs, then we directly obtain that if G is an oriented graph with delta min at least 2, then its dichromatic number is at most delta min. And this is just because we are excluding the first case by assuming that delta min is 2. And we are excluding the second and third cases because in both cases, D must contain a diagon. And if we look at the very first consequence of this result, we have that if you take a non-directed graph with maximum degree at most 5, and you fix an orientation of it, then you obtain an oriented graph in which delta min is at most 2, and in particular, it must be 2 dicolorable. And this was already open before. Now I would like to show you the proof because it is short. So assume that we have a digraph D for which the dichromatic number is exactly delta min plus 1. Then we'll show that either delta is 2 and D contains the diagon, or delta is at least 3 and we have this bidirected complete graph dominating another bidirected complete graph. So what we do is first we partition the vertices in 2 parts, and in X we put every vertex with out degree at most delta, and in Y we put every vertex with in degree at most delta. And if some vertex satisfies both inequalities, we just put it arbitrarily in one side. And then we make some transformations on this digraph. So first we remove every arc from Y to X, and then we replace the arcs from X to Y by diagons. And note that these two inequalities are still true because I just added arcs from Y to X. And what I claim is that the dichromatic number did not decrease. And in fact, this is because every dicoloring of this new digraph is also a dicoloring of the previous one. Okay, imagine that this is not the case. So we have a monochromatic directed cycle in D. Then it cannot be a directed cycle in X, otherwise it is also a directed cycle of D prime. And it cannot be contained in Y, so it must choose an arc from X to Y, which is a now diagon. So we have a monochromatic diagon, this is the contradiction. Then we can extract in D prime an induced subdigraph H, which is delta plus 1 vertex diacritical. So whenever we can remove a vertex such that the dichromatic number remains at least delta plus 1, we just remove it. And then we know that in a diacritical delta plus 1 diacritical digraph, every vertex has in degree and out degree at least delta. This is just by minimality. So these inequalities are now equalities in H. And if we sum the out degrees in XH, so the intersection between X and H, what you obtain is exactly delta times the number of vertices in XH. And this must be equal to the sum of the in degrees, because what we are computing is exactly the number of arcs inside XH plus the number of digons between XH and YH. And using the fact that every vertex has in degree at least delta, we obtain that H must be delta diregular. So every vertex has in degree and out degree exactly delta. And from this, we can use the directed Brooke theorem. So we have that H has dichromatic number exactly delta max of H plus 1. So either delta is 2 and H is a bidirected cycle, and one diagon of H must be in YH or in XH. So this is a diagon of D. Or delta is at least 3, and H is a bidirected complete graph. And we thus have a bidirected complete graph here, dominating a bidirected complete graph here. And we obtain the result. Now I would like to conclude with two further research directions. The first one is a celebrated conjecture due to Erdős and Neumann-Lara, which says that, in fact, for an oriented graph, the dichromatic number should be sublinear in the maximum degree. And this is open. We don't know. Okay, we don't have any sublinear bound. And the best bound approaching it is the existence of non-trivial multiplicative constants. So the dichromatic number of an oriented graph G is always at most 1 minus epsilon times delta tilde of G, where delta tilde is the maximum on every vertex of the geometric mean between the in and out degrees. So this is a parameter between delta min and delta max. So this is a result of Harutunian and Moha. And a very particular case of this conjecture that I don't know how to solve is the case of, okay, imagine we take two complete graphs on n vertices and we look at the square product. So it is an n by n grid, but instead of having a path on every row and every column, we have a complete graph instead. Then if the conjecture is true, every orientation of this graph should have a dichromatic number at most n over log n. And this I don't know how to solve. And if the conjecture is not true, then this might be a candidate for disproving it. And the second further research direction I would like to mention is related to a famous conjecture of Bruce Reed, which says that for every graph, the chromatic number is at most the average between the maximum degree plus 1 and the clique number. And this is open, and we just know it for small values of epsilon. So we know that for some epsilon, the chromatic number is always at most 1 minus epsilon times delta plus 1 plus epsilon times the clique number. And in a work in progress with Kawarabayashi, we believe that the same holds for digraphs by taking the maximum degree to be this delta tilde and the clique number to be the bidirected clique number. And we managed to prove the analog of this result of Reed. So the existence of epsilon such that dichromatic number is at most 1 minus epsilon times the delta plus 1 plus epsilon times the big-clique number. And what is nice is that if you look at this result on bidirected graphs, you obtain the result of Reed. And if you look at it on oriented graphs, you obtain the result of the previous slide of Harutunian and Moha. And okay, that's all I wanted to say today. Thank you.
Le jury a délibéré et voilà sa réponse. Dans un exposé très soigné, Luca Picasarri-Arrieta a présenté ses travaux sur la coloration de graphes orientés. Il a réussi à couvrir les nombreux résultats obtenus durant sa thèse. Il a également pris le temps de se concentrer sur un algorithme particulier et d'en exposer les principaux points techniques. Il a su répondre avec enthousiasme aux nombreuses questions du jury, allant de considérations techniques jusqu'à des perspectives portant sur ses récents travaux. Au vu des résultats qu'il a obtenus dans le domaine de la coloration et des nombreuses questions qu'il a su résoudre, le jury est unanimement convaincu que Luca ait promis un bel avenir d'enseignant-chercheur ou de chercheur. Pour toutes ces raisons, le jury lui décerne le titre de docteur en informatique de l'Université Côte d'Azur. Toutes nos félicitations.